All right, Mr. Little here again. Forgive me, I've actually got my washing machine going in the background, so you might be able to, or you might be hearing that as I go through this recording. But in our previous video, we talked through the need for psychological science. That was Module 4, in addition to the the first part of Module 5, which was the scientific method. Now we're going to shift gears into talking about some specific types of research that you might want to conduct, specifically descriptive studies. So our learning objective today is we're going to look at what we would label as kind of the three main descriptive studies. And by the end of this video, we want you to be able to explain how psychologists use case studies, naturalistic observations, and surveys to observe and describe behavior. And we're also going to talk a little bit about what random sampling is and why that's important, particularly when you're conducting a survey. But I have this graphic organizer in your Canvas page. I encourage you to take a look at it just to kind of help you organize your thoughts. This alone won't be enough to get all the information you need, but it can be kind of a cheat sheet for you if you need to remember what all different types of research there are and how those are categorized. So in this kind of graphic organizer, we just have descriptive studies. The three we're going to look at today are case studies, naturalistic observation, and surveys. We'll go into more detail in each of these, but what you need to remember about descriptive studies and why we call them descriptive studies is that they describe behavior, but they don't actually explain it. They're kind of a way of making observations about already existing behavior, but they don't really control any variables. And also something worth noting is that if you look at a single case, like a case study, that may be a little bit misleading. You may be looking at an outlier. But we do want to first take a look at a case study, and a case study is a descriptive study that takes, and I'm underlying and putting in red the key words here, a really in-depth look at an individual or a group. And this would typically be something that would be unusual or something extraordinary, some kind of phenomenon that's abnormal, and you want to take a closer look at to see if you can find some kind of underlying truth. Something I always tell my students is that if you're doing a case study, you're doing it on something worth studying. So some examples of abnormal events that might, or unusual things you might want to study are brain damage patients or animal intelligence. So here's just an example of the second of those two. This is a gorilla by the name of Coco, who a group of researchers actually figured out how to teach sign language to. So remember, this is something that's absolutely extraordinary. This isn't something you see every day. And so there were a number of case studies done on Coco to see if we could learn some kind of underlying truth on animal intelligence or animals' capacity to learn language. Another example that you learned about in Miss Dahmers's unit, or at least you were exposed to in Miss Dahmers's unit, I don't know if you've learned it or not, was Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in the 1800s who, in a terrible accident, had a metal rod actually get thrust through his skull, like you can see here. But Phineas Gage was something worth taking a closer look at and seeing how it's possible that someone could survive that. And another thing that researchers noted was that Gage his behavior changed considerably. He became a lot less inhibited, a lot more vulgar, a lot more aggressive. And this actually led the way to learn a lot more information about the role of the frontal lobes in the brain and how those are kind of in control of our judgment and our inhibition. So that is case studies. And just an exam tip as well. If someone does a case study, like I said, they do a really, really in-depth look at this person or group of people. And this would include things like interviewing people in the subject's life, so maybe previous teachers, family members, friends, or also looking through personal records. So these might be previous grades, these might be job history, but anytime you see that really, really in-depth dive and almost investigation about someone or a group of people, then you're probably looking at a case study. And I'll go through and just give some strengths and some limitations of each of these types of descriptive studies. But if you're looking at a case study, obviously the upside is that you can capture a lot of complexity. You can take an in-depth look. In the case of Phineas Gage, researchers were able to really describe his change in behavior before the metal rod went through his frontal lobes and after. It's also a good starting point for further research. So after this finding of Phineas Gage was made, then researchers were able to do a lot of work afterwards in exploring how different parts of the brain are responsible for different things, and it paved the way for a lot of neurological science. And also it might help the patient if researchers are taking a really close look at someone who maybe has something abnormal that affects them negatively. As they explore that case closely, they might be able to draw and explore some possible ways to help that patient. Limitations, though, are, remember, we're only looking at a sample size of 1 here. We'll talk a little more about that when we get into statistics of why that can't really generalize to greater populations. And it may be the case that you're just looking at an outlier. Take Coco, for example, the gorilla that learns sign language. We don't know if all animals are capable of that, or if Coco was just an extreme example of an incredibly smart primate and was more the exception than the norm. So speaking of primates, we are now going to talk about naturalistic observation. And this is one of those convenient words in psychology, and fortunately there are a lot of these, where the word kind of means what it says, right? You're going into a natural environment and you're just recording behavior. So it's defined as observing and recording behavior. Once again, this is important if it's highlighted in red, or if it's in red and highlighted and underlined. But observing and recording behavior in naturally occurring situations without trying to manipulate or control the environment. And the most famous example of naturalistic observation is the work of Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall went out into the forest and just watched chimpanzees. She didn't try to change their environment. She just sat back, took notes, and continued to observe those chimpanzees. But examples of naturalistic observation are not always with animals and in nature. In fact, there was a study I just heard about where researchers went to different cities with different populations and simply recorded the time it took people in these cities to cross different crosswalks. And I think this is fascinating. They actually found that with great accuracy, you can predict how big the city people are in by how fast they cross crosswalks. So as you can guess, in densely populated cities like New York City or Los Angeles, people cross crosswalks a lot faster, whereas if you're in a small town like Paoli or Cross Plains, people are going to cross a lot more slowly. So that's another example of naturalistic observation. Probably the one most relevant to you and one that has actually been done on you is what social media accounts are doing. These would also be classified as naturalistic observation. When you sign the terms and conditions for using these applications, they can track what you click on, they can observe your habits, they can observe what you like, what you comment on. So social media sites are almost always doing naturalistic observation. Another example of this would actually be if you've ever been in a classroom and an administrator has sat in the back and started taking notes on your teacher and observing them. This happened to me last semester with Ms. Suter, but that was a case of naturalistic observation as well. So some strengths and limitations of naturalistic observation. Strengths are that, remember, you're observing something in its natural environment. So when you do an experiment, for example, and we'll talk about this, you're kind of creating an artificial environment, and people may not act as naturally as they would there than they would in real life. So naturalistic observations have what we would call high ecological validity, meaning they strongly relate to how people would act in the real world. They're also cheap and easy to do. Remember, all you're doing is you're observing something that's already happening. You don't have to spend a lot of money on setting something up or anything like that. You're just going and you're making observations. You're taking notes. Limitations, you're just describing behavior. You're not explaining it. All you can do is look at what's happening on the surface level. You can't really explain why that is. Or what underlying causes there might be for what you're observing. And oftentimes when you do this, you also need informed consent from a participant, meaning you need their permission to observe them. This would be the case like if I were teaching a class and being observed. This would impact the experiment or the observations because obviously if there's an administrator in the room, I'm going to act a little bit differently. I'm probably going to try to appease them and teach better than I would normally. Not that I don't normally teach well. So our final type of descriptive study is the survey. And the survey is probably the one you've actually taken most often or been a part of, particularly during this school year as administrators are trying to gauge your attitudes and teachers are trying to gauge your attitudes towards virtual learning, what things are working, what things aren't working. But a survey is a way that we can try to gauge people's self-reported attitudes or behaviors of a particular group or what we would call a population. And so to make a good survey or to make a valid survey, basically what you need is what we would call a random sample taken from a population. And when we say population, we're not referring necessarily to the entire population of the world. A population is just all of the members of a group that are being studied. So a population could be everyone living in the United States. A population could be just students at VHS. If I wanted to gauge the attitudes of my students, my population could just be students taking AP Psychology in my section second semester. So any group whose attitudes you're trying to explore are what we would consider a population. Now, what do we mean when we say taking a random sample from that population? A lot of times it's you really can't actually interview or get a survey from every single person in a population, particularly if it's something big like the United States. So what you need to do is take a sample of people from that population, measure their attitudes, and try to generalize those to the entire population. So a random sample is a sample of participants taken from a population that, and here's the key word, represents the whole population. So if my population was just students at Verona Area High School, I wanted to gauge the attitudes of however many thousand students there are at Verona. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to just measure the attitudes of everyone in my own class, right? Because you guys are all seniors, and you may see the school differently than freshmen, sophomores, and juniors. You're also all taking an AP class, and that alone would make you probably on the higher end of academic achievement and maybe a bias sample in that way. So if I take a random sample from a survey, I would want that sample to represent the entire population. So I would want to have equal representation of students who are at every grade level, so freshmen, sophomores, juniors. I would want representation of all different races, ethnicities, genders within the school, people taking a variety of different classes. The basic criteria for a sample to be random that you're taking in a survey is that every single member of the population has an equal chance of being included in that survey. So if I were taking a sample of students at Verona Area High School, I would want any given freshman to have an equal chance of being included in that survey as any given senior, any given sophomore, etc. So I wanted to get through more with this video, but I have a 15-minute cap of what I can actually talk through. So I'm going to leave off here, and I'll talk through some of the rest of the things I didn't quite get through in class when we get the chance. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you in class. Thank you all.